But the reality is they were just aiming way lower than where they needed to be. And essentially in Bahrain, they got found out.
Choo choo!
My guy.
All aboard the Alonso hype train.
I genuinely think Alonso did a better job at the weekend than Vettel would have done.
What a freaking performance from him.
But if you're Lando right now, you've got to be looking around and thinking, how have I tied myself down here?
We're back for our first post-race show of Unlapped of the season. That feels so good to say. Bahrain is in the books. Katie George, Nate Saunders, Laurence Edmondson. And I've got the receipts right here from your all's first predictions of the season. I have to hand it to you, Nate. Decent job.
Not bad, right? Two out of three.
Not bad. Just as a reminder, if you didn't catch last week's episode, Nate projected Max Verstappen to win, Charles Leclerc to finish second. We'll get into it. But you went out on a limb and you projected Fernando Alonso to finish on the podium, which he in fact did for Aston Martin.
He did indeed. So I'm kind of, this is a bittersweet thing because I did back him in this, but I didn't actually put any bets on him. Okay. And I'm not a big better, but I did look at it and I thought I could have made a little bit of money from that myself. But yeah, I'm so glad that came off because, making it after testing, it seemed like, hey, this could happen. And then, during the race, that obviously slipped down during qualifying. I was like, oh, maybe it's not as good as we thought. But yeah, a mega story. And I think it means I start the year on a stronger foot than Laurence, which is always a good sign because I think over 23 races, Laurence is probably going to outpredict me. So I'm going to take this one as a win. Yeah.
Laurence, you did predict that Sergio Perez would be on the podium. So you were one of two, which I think is a fair start.
Yeah, from memory, I went with something happening to Max Verstappen that meant that he wasn't even in the top three, a reliability issue.
Yours was based on hope, and mine was based more on Fernando hope, and yours was on hope of a good championship.
Well, I seem to remember you saying Fernando Alonso and me thinking, right, okay, I've got to up it somehow and find a way to go with a more bold prediction than that. I'll rein it in next time.
Yeah, I had the benefit of going first as well, which means I could do that. I could kind of flex it.
You did. Next week, we'll let Laurence go first. So right now, 1-0 to start the season. Well done, Nate. Remember, if you're watching on YouTube, like this video, leave us a comment, and don't forget to subscribe to ESPN for more F1 content. And if you're listening, hit us with a 5-star review wherever you get your podcasts. A lot of storylines coming out of Bahrain. Glad that you both are on the ground back in London. Let's dive right into it. Obviously, Red Bull's dominance was a big storyline. Aston Martin and the resurgence there was something that we'll definitely get into. But let's start with Mercedes because I think we can all agree that it was an underwhelming performance. They were far off the pace, and there was a lot of negativity early on before the race even took place in the days leading up. Laurence, we had talked about this a couple of weeks ago that they doubled down on the slim side pods or the zero pod concept in that car. And it felt like maybe the right decision. They got rid of the porpoising, but based on the performance all weekend long, what is going on with Mercedes and what can we expect from them moving forward?
Well, they're miles away from where they want to be and where they need to be. Mercedes are a team that go for world championships. That's what they've done for the past 10 years or so. And now to be in a position where they can't even get close to scoring a victory, it's really bad news. And I think they kind of lulled themselves into a false sense of security at the end of last year. They made big progress through the year with what was quite a radical concept compared to a lot of the other teams. Certainly they were going their own way. No one copied them. No one had come up with a similar idea. But by the end of the year, they'd won a race in Brazil. So they thought, well, if we continue on this trajectory, we'll be fine. I think where they got blindsided was that Red Bull, meanwhile, have quite clearly not put a huge amount of effort into their car towards the end of last year because they've been putting it all into this year. A key factor being this kind of lightweight chassis, which means they're under the weight limit, which means they can play with it. And that's just unlocked so much performance for them while they've also been able to develop within that set of regulations. And so Mercedes, with the car they had last year, they set themselves some targets. They felt they were quite ambitious targets. But the reality is, and they hit those targets, but the reality is they were just aiming way lower than where they needed to be. And essentially in Bahrain, they got found out. And I think they realized this during testing. They could see the data coming through. I was trying to put a positive spin on it because historically Mercedes often underperform in testing to then show their real hand in the race. But that was it. And so to turn up in Bahrain and not only be so far off Red Bull, but also to be outraced by Aston Martin and outqualified by Aston Martin, a team that is a customer of Mercedes in that they use Mercedes engine, Mercedes gearbox, Mercedes rear suspension. They use Mercedes wind tunnel to design their aerodynamic package, which is where the big differences are coming from. That was very humbling for the team. And I think as a result, that's why we saw so much negativity from Toto Wolff, from George Russell, about where this team is, because if everyone is completely honest with themselves, they already know they're not fighting for a championship this year.
I'm glad that you used the word humbling, because I think if you're Toto Wolff, you have to swallow your pride in some of the comments that he made. And you guys know the history of this sport better than I. I think I used an analogy on the post-race show from Bristol right after Bahrain, in the fact of a front office member drafting a lottery pick and then it not turning out or working out, and they just missed on whether that guy was going to be able to change the franchise. And a lot of front office members will hold on to that player for way too long because they just don't want to admit that their evaluation was wrong. It seems to me that Toto's making kind of a quick evaluation here. And would you, Nate, respect the decision that he's swallowing his pride and saying, hey, this is a hard truth that we have to accept and we got to scrap this thing and move on?
Yeah, I mean, you're completely right about a quick decision. It was literally a 60-minute qualifying session is all it took. And, you know, in the world of Formula One, usually you want to look at a concept over a few races. Bahrain's a very specific place. So I think people were surprised at how quickly they'd done that. And I know that Toto was asked that exact question about, you know, how did you come to this decision so quickly? Why were you so open about it? You know, they could have lied to everyone, said, no, we're happy with this. And then down the line started going a different direction. And I think Toto's quote was, he said, you know, we don't BS you. I mean, he used the full word that I'm hyphenating there. But I think I think they're at a point now, Mercedes, where they really can't hide behind that lie, you know, and say we're happy with this concept, because the drivers were kind of clearly a bit like, well, we're not sure if this is the right thing now. And I think that the sheer scale of how far ahead Red Bull was really kind of accelerated that decision. I think they realized, like, look, if we keep chasing this concept right now, we could be even further behind by the end of this year, and then we're nowhere, you know, until the rules change again. So I think there's been some pretty difficult conversations behind closed doors. And I'm quite curious. I mean, the driver feedback has been kind of, you know, it's been up and down. You know, they're obviously happy they got rid of the bouncing at the start of testing, but both drivers were pretty clear that they weren't where they wanted to be. So you wonder how much influence that's had behind the scenes. But I think it's got to be, I mean, Laurence might remember better than me a better example, but it seems like the biggest kind of climb down from a leading team in terms of a concept. I can't remember another team coming out after one race and saying, yeah, this design concept we've got is completely wrong. You know, some teams have said, look, this isn't the concept we're going to have for the rest of the season. And they've said that before the race. But Mercedes has gone for being super bullish about this thing, being like, this is the best thing. This is the best thing for us. This is going to win us titles, to saying, no, it's not going to win us titles. We've got to do more along the lines of what Red Bull are doing. So yeah, pretty remarkable stuff.
I think it was.
I think if you, oh, sorry, Katie.
No, go.
I think if you read between the lines of some of what they were saying at the launch, it was quite clear that they knew already that they were in a bit of trouble. They were saying this will get us titles eventually, or this will allow us to fight for victories eventually. So they knew they were going to have this slow start to the season. The really concerning thing is that Mercedes have pursued some of the other concepts in the wind tunnel behind closed doors at their factory in the design office, and they still came to the conclusion that theirs was the best. So clearly they are missing something quite fundamental in how Red Bull are creating such a fast car, how Aston Martin have made such dramatic gains in such a short period of time. It seems like Mercedes don't understand how their rivals have done that at this stage. And that is worrying for them, because it's not a case of, right, we just go back, you know, into the wind tunnel and, you know, we do this and we're going to find all this time. They've got to understand how Red Bull are doing that before they can start to develop their own concept. And as Toto correctly said on Sunday, they're already a year behind. I mean, realistically, more than that, because there was all the development of the car going into last year. There was all of last year, and now we're here. Toto said that really they've got to focus on they've got to basically pick their design philosophy now for the future and focus on one, because you can't afford to focus on two. One, you'll get a bit lost with development, but also under the budget cap with limited resources, and also under the aerodynamic testing restrictions that all teams have. The teams further up the grid have even more. There's not the bandwidth or the money to go chasing multiple concepts. So they have to change their concept. They think they know that now, but they have to pick one that, first of all, they need to understand, and then they need to know that it's got enough long-term benefits. So it feels like there's such a long way back from where they should be. So I think that's why Toto was the way he was over the weekend. And to be honest, at least he was open. Like Nate said, there was no BS in his comments.
An ominous picture that you're painting, for sure, which is all the more surprising that this is what Lewis Hamilton had to say post-race.
I loved the race. I loved racing, so I'm happy that it was kind of smooth sailing. I had a great start. Got Fernando in turn 4, and I was like, geez, this is a great start to a race. Felt like one of my better opening laps. But then I just was sliding around. I couldn't turn. I had so much understeer at the beginning. I took so much wing out. I couldn't get around some of the corners, and I just couldn't keep up with the guys ahead. But my mid stint was good, and then at the end, just so close to catching Carlos, but not good enough.
Nate, are you surprised by what seemed like a pretty positive attitude after what was, we would all agree, an underwhelming performance in terms of Mercedes standards?
Yeah, Lewis was weirdly chipper, wasn't he, all weekend? I think he genuinely enjoyed the fight with Fernando. So on that Sunday, he was kind of in a good mood from that. And he said coming into the weekend, he said, I'm a fighter, I don't give up. And I think maybe he relishes this challenge, or maybe he doesn't really. Maybe the severity of it from our perspective is lesser from his point of view. Maybe he's always said he's got huge faith in that team and Mercedes' ability to win. So maybe he does think, hey, we can do this. This isn't insurmountable. But yeah, it didn't quite chime with what Toto was saying, and that was one of the interesting things, that the drivers, they weren't always singing off the same hymn sheet the whole weekend. Toto would be like, this is, he'd be saying one thing, the drivers might be saying something slightly different. I'm not saying they're not agreeing behind the scenes, but it did seem strange. There wasn't, one mood coming out of the camp the whole weekend. It did seem a bit, like people, I think it maybe day to day, especially with the drivers, they might have a better day in the car and they came out feeling a bit better. But George was so different to Lewis on the Sunday.
He was.
I think it made a lot of headlines. He was basically like, if I was making a bet now, Red Bull win all 23 races, they've got the championship sewn up. And that wasn't the vibe Lewis was getting, and George was like, we might not do anything this year. We need to focus on 24 immediately. So, it did stand out a bit.
You have an article right now on ESPN.com, Bahrain Grand Prix overreactions. And a part of your headline is Lewis Hamilton might never win an F1 race again. And then you go into some detail of if that's an overreaction or not an overreaction. Feel free to tell us what you think.
Yeah, so I went with not an overreaction. And I have to clarify, that doesn't mean I don't think Lewis... I'm not saying he never will win a race again, but I'm saying it's not an overreaction to think that we might have seen his last win, his 103rd win in 2021 now, which is so long ago when you actually think about it. But everything that Laurence just said, when he was saying about how far back Mercedes are, they've slipped quite comfortably to being the third best team, maybe the fourth best team. And if you look at the way F1 is, since I started covering Formula One in 2014, there's been a big three. And the lead team has won most of the races in that season. The second place team has probably challenged for some wins. The third place team might be there to mop some up, but it's quite rare we get all three really challenging regularly for race victories. And look at Fernando Alonso. He's had 10 years nearly without a win, through being in the wrong place, through making bad decisions. And, he spent half of that 10 years at McLaren when they couldn't even get out of Q1 a lot of the time. So I think Lewis is in a position where, he might be able to win a fluke race here or there. But in terms of having a car that's going to put him in position to win races every week, I think that window's gone for him now. And, he's one of the older drivers on the grid, and you can see that opportunity never coming back for him. He had an incredible spell, and the car is such a huge part of it. So, I've been getting some interesting replies on Twitter to that, to that article. But yeah, it's sad as well, because it's crazy. I end that bit by saying that if you think about it, we all look at that Verstappen overtake of Lewis in Abu Dhabi 21, and it's like that was the moment that denied him the 8th championship, obviously, and all the controversy that went around with that. But how crazy would it be if that also denied him the 104th win that he's not going to get? It adds a whole other level to that moment. Not that it wasn't big enough already, but you just think, wow, like that literally was like the sliding doors moment for Lewis. If you believe my article, we'll see in a few years. I mean, I'm happy to be proven wrong. Lewis is good at proving people wrong, so I'm sure he'll relish the.
Hope so.
Yeah, and there's a lot of people that were saying the same to me, like, well, Lewis will prove you wrong. And I was like, hey, it wasn't a challenge to Lewis. It was more just a statement of, not fact, a statement of quite enthusiastic opinion, I suppose.
Well, time, as we have clearly painted, is not necessarily on his side with the car that he currently is in. Let's shift gears to Ferrari. Laurence, what did you make of the Tifosi's team's performance over the weekend?
it seemed a lot like more of the same from last year, didn't it? I mean, all the issues that were on display, apart from maybe strategy, which was actually relatively strong, but it was a very straightforward race for them, seemed to be off in that they had a reliability issue. In fact, they had one before the race even started. They changed the energy store on Charles Leclerc's car, which is the battery for the hybrid system. And then he had a problem in the race, which I haven't quite heard what the reason was yet. I'm not sure they've said publicly yet, but there's some rumors that it may also be energy store related. So you've got this, this situation where the issue that was holding them back all last year, engine reliability, is there again, plus tire degradation, which was an issue towards the end of last year, certainly in the second half of the season, was there, and that's what cost Carlos Sainz a podium. And arguably would have been very interesting to see if Leclerc had finished the race, how close Fernando would have got, because his tire degradation was fantastic. So, he didn't have it. So it's worrying for Ferrari, but I'm a little bit more positive in that one, reliability issues, you hope they find the cause and they can fix it. You can work on the power units and the reliability over the course of the year. They actually thought they had done a pretty good job of that over the winter. They said they ran all these miles on their test dyno and all the miles in testing, and they didn't have any problems. And then in the race, it happens. And then in terms of the tire degradation, well, Bahrain is one of the toughest, if not the toughest, circuit on the calendar on rear tires, which is where Ferrari was struggling. And if you look at kind of where they were elsewhere and, kind of the general performance indicators, where they were in qualifying, 0.3 seconds off Red Bull, but with Leclerc not doing a second run in qualifying, where presumably he would have found some extra time. He actually did that because he wanted to save tires for the race, which I don't think was a bad idea, because I don't think he would have beaten Verstappen to pole. But there are.
And he had a great start.
And he had a great start, got up to second place, but then obviously lost position to Perez because Perez was able to do the second stint on soft tires, because again, how they look after their tires compared to how the Ferrari was looking after its tires. So there's some worrying signs there, but I kind of feel that on a different track, they'll be closer to Red Bull and potentially ahead of Aston Martin if they're able to make the finish and they don't suffer the tire degradation that's such a big thing in Bahrain. So there's some hope in there, but I think they know as well, going into the season, they wanted to challenge for championships again. They've made that very clear. Fred Vasseur a number of times made it clear that that's the team's objective this year. Well, they don't look like they can do that at the moment. They look like they might challenge for the odd victory, but championships seem a long way away given where Red Bull were.
Now, Laurence, you attended a couple of Fred Vasseur's debriefs over the weekend and got to spend some time with them. What was that like, and what were some of your takeaways from him and his new role as team boss at Ferrari?
I think he's still being quite careful, certainly in front of the media with what he says. He's quite a different character to Mattia Binotto, who he replaced over the winter. Mattia was very methodical, very serious in talking to the media, whereas Fred likes to crack a joke. If there's a question he doesn't like, he kind of manages to charm his way out of it and talk about something else, which is, I think, actually quite useful for the life of a team principal in Formula One. You can get yourself out of a bit of trouble with a good sense of humor. So I think he's got that. But I do get the impression that he's come in there and he's not afraid to make some changes. We knew going into this race that he made some changes to who was on the pit wall, who was making the final calls on strategy decisions. And he kept saying that, this is not about individuals. This is the problems we have with strategy. We're much more a part of the whole system we have in place, and we're addressing that and changing that. But he also made a big change in that he got rid of Inaki Ueda from the pit wall. So that's, that was a big step. And I think that kind of indicates that, they're not where they are right now, where they want to be right now. But over time, with change and kind of looking at where the problems are, Fred seems to be in a position that he's willing to make those changes and address the problems. But ultimately, the biggest issue they face is car performance right now, because they're not with Red Bull. So even if they solve all the reliability issues, even if they can completely get on top of tire degradation, the raw performance of the car just isn't there, and that's a hard thing to catch up. Especially as we were talking about earlier, different philosophies of car. Well, Ferrari have a different one again, and if I were to put money on which one has the best long-term prospects, I'd probably go with Red Bull based on what we've seen.
You know who else was up there near the Red Bull? Choo choo.
My guy.
All aboard the Alonso hype train, Mr. Nate Saunders. You were feeling it a couple weeks ago. Obviously, you can gloat and feel it now. I mean, where do we even begin with the resurgence? And obviously, Fernando is such a great personality, a two-time world champion. Seeing him with this machine was awesome. But why do you think there has been such a resurgence at Aston Martin this year, this quickly?
Yeah, I mean, I put that question to Christian Horner on Sunday. I said, "Are you surprised?" We kind of the logic of the paddock was that no team was going to make that jump. If you look at Alpine and McLaren over the last few years, they've kind of been stuck there, waiting for regulation changes, waiting, long-term projects, etc. And fair play to Laurence Stroll. He's invested massively in that team. He's brought in two massively talented people, Dan Fallows, who came from Red Bull, and Eric Blandin, who came from Mercedes. So he's brought in two minds from the only two teams that have won championships since 2010. And I think that always is quite, it can go under the radar a bit when people do that. It's not just about the know-how about what they're doing with a car, but it's also what they know about those teams, and they can say, look, we did this at this team and we won X number of championships by doing this. So I think he's been very smart. And obviously one of the big moves as well last year was Fernando Alonso. And I don't think that can be understated either. I think Alonso's gone in there, and I genuinely, I tweeted this and a load of Vettel fans came after me, but I genuinely think Alonso did a better job at the weekend than Vettel would have done. I think just in terms of how good he's been for so long, he doesn't make mistakes. He's consistently got the best out of that car. He's probably the perfect person you want in that kind of situation for Aston Martin. They know they've got something good. You're going to have a driver there every week who's just hustling it completely. We saw Vettel making mistakes over the past kind of 3-4 years, especially, since kind of Hockenheim 2018, I've always thought he was a bit of a different driver. So I think that's been a big thing as well. And since Spain last year, so even before Alonso came and before they'd made some of these big appointments, they'd recognized Red Bull as the concept to kind of go towards. So that's actually been a long time coming. They've started shifting towards that. But yeah, during the weekend, I was speaking to people I know at Aston Martin, and I was like, this is pretty good, isn't it? And they were like, well, we'll see. You could tell. Even when we got to Saturday, and we're going into qualifying, they didn't want to say, because they were like, it could all look different when we qualify. And Fernando Alonso said that as well. He said, we knew we weren't in the fight with Red Bull, even though he had put those practice times in. I think the hype almost ruined the story, because we suddenly were like, well, maybe he can win the race. And obviously Red Bull is so far down the road, but what they did was pretty remarkable. And yeah, what will be interesting now will be seeing how much it is replicated over other circuits, but they've clearly built a very, very good car. I think the most exciting thing from them, and again, something that the whole team deserves credit for, is that because of the nature of their car, there's so much to extract from that. There's so much more potential to come. So they could be there to stay. And I think that to do that, over one winter, Christian Horner joked, it's nice to see the other Red Bull up here as well, on the podium. But yeah, I think, they've obviously done the smart thing, and they've probably come from, they probably had nothing to lose last year, whereas if you look at Ferrari, Mercedes, they obviously were hoping they'd have title aspirations. I think last year, the more you look at it now, clearly Aston, I'm not saying they threw the towel in, but I think that their focus had shifted last year, maybe earlier than we realized at the time.
Well, let's hear from Fernando after his P3 finish.
It means a lot to everyone in the team. We didn't expect to be that competitive. I think we didn't expect to be in the podium, to be honest, in 2023. We thought just to start the project, change the concept of the car, try to be in the midfield or in the front part of the midfield, and then eventually in 2024, get closer to the top three teams. And we found out that we had the second best car in Bahrain, just behind Red Bull. So this is just an amazing surprise. Very proud of the team, and hopefully from now on we can build something more aggressive in terms of expectations, and yeah, keep on going.
Just how far do you think you can go? Because you've always wanted that baseline car here, haven't you? And you've got that, and now I guess the world's your oyster.
Yeah, the thing is that I think Red Bull or Ferrari, they are just a continuation of the project that they started last year, so they are just refining that project and that car. For us, everything is new. It's a completely new concept this year on the car, so I guess we will find more performance during the season because everything is new for us. So this is very encouraging.
It's an interesting comment, Laurence, the difference between what Aston Martin did and what Mercedes did. Mercedes doubled down on their concept, where Fernando kind of alludes to Aston Martin scrapping theirs and starting fresh. Do you feel like that's a fair assertion?
Yeah, they did. I mean, they did it very early in the regulations. So they started last year, at the very start of last year, really as the 8th or 9th fastest team, way off where that team wanted to be. And a lot of people pointing the finger and saying, look, Laurence Stroll spent all this money and what's it achieved? Now, they quite quickly recognized that and changed. And so by the Spanish Grand Prix, they had a car which looked very similar to the Red Bull, to the point that there were even questions about the legality of it, how they'd arrived at that place. Dan Fallows had just joined the team, but they were found that actually it was completely fine, and they come up with it through their own means, and in pretty much in the way that any other Formula One team develops a car. You do take some inspiration, but you also have to understand how it works and put it together and put it on track. So they've done that. I guess what's interesting, if you look at the end result of the Bahrain Grand Prix, is that you had Max Verstappen winning by 11 seconds from Checo, and then 39 seconds to Fernando Alonso. Now, 39-second gap between the front of the midfield and the race winner is not unusual in recent years in Formula One. That's roughly where you expect it to be. The unusual thing was that there wasn't a Ferrari or Mercedes plugging that gap or closer to Red Bull. So while, look, I'm not taking anything away from what Aston Martin have done, they've absolutely nailed it. If you think if you look at it another way, it's more that Red Bull and Ferrari and Mercedes have really messed up and are not in that position where they should be. And then if you start to divide the grid into different car concepts, well, the Aston Martin is very close to the Red Bull. So, they've both made massive steps forward over the winter, whereas teams following no one really follows a Mercedes design concept because it's so unique and so weird. But if you look at teams following the Ferrari concept, they haven't quite maybe made the step forward that they'd hoped. Williams, another one which has some similarities to the Red Bull, they made huge gains from where they were at the start of last year to where they are at the start of this year. And now it's not as obvious because they were so far off the back of the grid last year, but they are now in a much better position. So when you look at it like that, I think Aston have made the right decisions at the right time. And I think what they've really benefited from is good technical leadership. Someone at the top, most recently, Dan Fallows, saying, right, we need to do this. And Dan Fallows, coming from Red Bull, had a good idea of exactly what was needed to build a good car. So I think that's just paid off. And, the exciting thing about Aston Martin is that this is just a start, because they don't move into their new factory until May this year. And now that might result in some short-term difficulties because it's a lot of people to move across. It's a lot of new machines that are going to start working. But long-term, that will allow them to bring updates quicker to the car because they'll have better manufacturing capability. I've seen the design office. I've been in there as they were building it. And it's this lovely, beautiful, open plan design office where people will be able to exchange ideas much more freely compared to now, where essentially they're working out of porta cabins. I don't know if porta cabins is the right word in American English, but temporary buildings. They're working out temporary buildings stacked on top of each other, almost like kind of shipping containers stacked on top of each other.
Yeah,
that's what they're working out at the moment. So when they get into this new office, which is going to, the idea to have ideas flowing around, concepts and things like that, essentially it should all push them forward. And then coming another year or so down the line, they have their own wind tunnel, which they claim is going to be the best wind tunnel in F1, better than Mercedes one, which they're using at the moment. So it really does feel like it's the start of something pretty special there. And I don't think anybody expected them to make these gains so quickly, and that they have already made these gains. And then there's a potential for more is probably what's got Mercedes and Ferrari a little bit worried as well as probably Red Bull.
Sure. I would like to say I had all but written off Lance Stroll a week ago. Just, based on the extent of his injuries, I thought there was no way that he was going to be able to operate that car. What a freaking performance from him. I mean, I just don't think we can say enough. Yes, obviously Fernando stole the show, finishing on the podium, but what a great drive by Lance, considering all that he was up against just 2 weeks ago, Nate.
Yeah, and he said that the doctors told him when he had that accident he won't race till Australia, which is obviously the second race is about 4 weeks on from Bahrain. And I've got to say, I was the same. I was super impressed. Stroll doesn't always get the easiest ride from the media or fans. Partly because of who his dad is, partly because of how he got that seat. But I think he showed a lot in that whole weekend. To come back, he was clearly in pain as well. Even when I saw him when he came into the media pen, and he was given a pen by a fan to sign an autograph, and he was wincing as he was signing the autograph. And clearly was carrying a lot of pain with him. There's a shot of him on the national anthem as well. He claps his hands together, and he obviously realizes how much pain that puts him in, and he winces again. So he was doing all of that, and I mean, it could so easily have been different. The one thing he didn't do right in the race was when he nearly went into the back of Fernando, which actually, if you look at the replay, he's kind of reacting to a gap that suddenly doesn't exist because Fernando moves very aggressively into the corner. So I don't think that it was as crazy as it looked on the replay, but that could have changed the whole complexion of the weekend, actually. So I'm glad that wasn't the story, because it would have been for Lance to have done all that to come back, to have fought through the pain, and then for it to have all ended, and for him to have, that would have blown the team's big result this weekend. We wouldn't be talking about them very favorably. We'd be saying, well, what a nightmare, the son of the billionaire, he ruined it all. So yeah, he did a great job, and I think he proved to a lot of people how much he does care about Formula One, because I think I've said it before, I've questioned his passion and whether he wants to be doing it. So you don't do that if you're not interested.
I have to say, one of my favorite moments of the race was when Alonso apparently kept asking his engineer, hey, by the way, we're like on lap 40. He's still asking, who was it that hit me on the first lap of the race? And they wouldn't tell him, which I absolutely love.
He thought it was Russell, I think. And you can just imagine that, can't you? He's like, who was it? And they're like, yeah, no, pace looks good, Fernando. Pace looks good. Just keep it up.
Keep it up. Keep focus.
Yeah, they probably at that point they thought there's no reason to tell him, right? We don't want to anger this guy or frustrate him. Like, we're in a great position. We can deal with that after. And to be fair to Alonso, he often kind of throws his teammates under a bus in that situation. And I've never heard Fernando Alonso speak so positively about a teammate. He's always, previously he's always put something. He could praise somebody, and then for 99% of his answer, but then that final 1% is him kind of being like, but I'm still better. All week he was. I mean, I think he called Lance Stroll his hero at one point. He said, "What this guy's done
his blanking hero," I think was.
Yeah, that's right. So how long that continues, we'll see. But the whole vibe of that team at the moment is really good, which I wasn't expecting. That wasn't on my Aston Martin bingo card for the start of the season. I didn't see it going that way at all.
When it comes to Red Bull, Laurence, what else really is there to say at this point?
Only that they're going to be incredibly tough to beat. I mean, we've mentioned already George Russell's comments after the race that they can win every race. Well, I think they can win every race, judging by the pace of that car and how much extra it seemed to have in hand. They can do that. Whether they will do that is another thing, because I think anybody who's watched Formula One over years and years and years know that to get the perfect season is so difficult. The closest any team had come before us in 1988, when McLaren won 15 of 16 races with Alan Prost and Ayrton Senna doing the winning that year. But to do all 23, I think is probably going to be too much. I mean, it's certainly be too much for me trying to report on it and come up with different ways to say that either Max Verstappen or Sergio Perez have won a race. But look, it's kind of unfortunate for the sport in that it's not that exciting to see a team go and win race after race after race, but you can't take anything away from Red Bull. It was the same situation when Mercedes were dominating and Lewis Hamilton was going from championship to championship. Well, it was dull at times, but you couldn't blame Mercedes for doing it. It was all the teams that hadn't caught up. And so it's exactly the same situation now. You got to take your hat off to Red Bull, say what a fantastic job they've done, what a brilliant understanding of these new regulations they've been able to attain in such a short period of time, and then look to the other teams to make the sport more interesting again. But I don't know what else we can say about them. Just brilliant.
I felt bad for their sponsors because we rarely saw Max on the broadcast because he was so far ahead. Nate, you included this as an overreaction, not an overreaction. Red Bull can win all 23 races in your article. What say you?
Yeah, I think I know why Russell made that, that comment on Sunday evening that they could win every race. But I mean, to do that and have no bad luck at all and have no reliability issues, have no races where one of the drivers is caught up on the first corner of the first lap, I just think is unlikely. But have to agree with everything Laurence said. And sadly, the one thing that saved a few of those Mercedes seasons was that, especially in 2014 and 2016, was that Rosberg was there to kind of fight Hamilton and took it to the final race both times. I don't think that's happening this year. As much as people love Checo Perez, I think he'll get a handful of wins at best. I think this is a Max Verstappen kind of Yeah, I mean, he might even break his own record from last year. You know, he had 15 wins last season. I could see him winning more than that this year. Which, yeah, is never nice to say after the first pod, but that's just where we're at.
Let's maybe turn our attention to the back of the grid. We knew that there might not be some performance based on the missing of developmental and performance tests in the winter, but what the heck has happened to McLaren? I don't know which one would rather take this, but I'll leave it to you. Raise your hand who wants to take what is McLaren right now.
I mean, I think it is exactly what you said. They set themselves targets. So we talked about Mercedes earlier, setting themselves targets, hitting them, then realizing they weren't enough. McLaren didn't even hit their targets, and they're in a position now where not only is the performance not there, the reliability wasn't there. Both their cars suffered reliability issues. Oscar Piastri on his debut, we didn't really get to see what he was capable of because I think it was by lap 15, the car had refused to change gears and he had to come into the pits, and they tried to solve it by changing the steering wheel, which is a very old school way of resetting a Formula 1 car, and that didn't work. And then Lando Norris's car had issues with pneumatic pressure, so he made, I can't remember how many pit stops, 4 or 5 in the race. So 6, really.
6
wow.
stops. Yeah, the patented 6 stopper.
Yeah, just to top up the gas on that car to keep the engine ticking over. So maybe that was partly a Mercedes issue. They run Mercedes engines, but still, it's not good. I mean, I suppose some of the positives, well, like when the car was running, it wasn't that slow. But the thing is, Norris always had new tires on his cars because he'd always just made a pit stop. I think they were one of the only teams to use the medium compound tire, which no one wanted to use, but mainly because they were running out of tires to throw at the car every time it came in. So it was really became a test session by that point. Like, what can we learn by just being out there? Even if we have to top up the car with gas each time it comes in. So, yeah, I don't know where they go from here, other than that they've been saying from the very start of the season that they're relying on an upgrade around Baku time to set some of it right. But it's a long way from where they want to be. And then when you look at what Aston Martin's achieved, well, that's what McLaren wanted to do this year. That's exactly where they were targeting to be close to that top 3. And if the top 3 slipped up, part of that top 3, 4, whatever it would become. And they're miles off. So it's a tough situation, and pretty tricky one for the 2 drivers as well, Lando Norris and Oscar Piastri.
Well, Nate, in your article, you have McLaren will be lucky to finish top 6. I mean, think about that. They were edged out by Alpine a season ago to finish 5th. They wanted to make strides. Clearly, they haven't. I mean, if you're Lando Norris, who we all know is an incredibly capable driver, what's going through your mind?
Well, I don't know what's going on in Lando's mind at the moment, because he continually insists, he's like, I'm fine here, I'm happy here. I think we spoke about it before the test. There was this kind of rumor going around that he'd punched the side of the garage during testing. He and the team were very upset. That was Will Buxton from F1 TV who said that. And they completely denied that had happened. But I mean, I don't know what Will saw. He might have seen that. I don't know. But yeah, I think Lando is going to be the thing that gives them the biggest headache this year. It's not going to be the car. It's not going to be Piastri. I think Piastri is probably, in a weird way, is being helped by all of this stuff, because he can just turn around and be like, well, the car is terrible. So anything he's doing in his rookie season, he's got that easy excuse. But if you're Lando right now, you've got to be looking around and thinking, how have I tied myself down here? You've probably been told time and time again, look, when we get our wind tunnel online, when we get all these things done that we've been looking to do, then we'll be back at the front. And then you turn around, you see Aston Martin do what they've done in the space of, less than 12 months. You look and think, well, hang on, why can't we do that? If you've ever, Laurence and I are very lucky, we've both been to the McLaren headquarters. Laurence mentioned there that they're just finishing off the Silverstone headquarters for Aston Martin. McLaren's headquarters is like, I think they used it to film part of the Avengers, I'm pretty sure. Like, it's so state of the art that
is that true? That makes so much sense. Sorry.
Yeah, no. So parts of it are when I forget which Avengers movie it's in, and I might have completely made this up. Sometimes I make up facts out of nowhere, but I'm pretty sure they used.
I hope this is a true fact.
They used aerial shots for something, but that's the kind of building we're talking about. Laurence, I think, is about to debunk my fact.
No, I don't know about the Avengers. I haven't watched all of them in that much detail, but it's definitely in Andor, the new Star Wars.
Yes,
that Andor. It features a number of times of that. Inside, it's one of the space stations, and you go in there, and it is like a space station. It is a remarkable building, But it's actually always been a building which those that have worked inside have kind of criticised, because just as I was saying earlier, how Aston Martin have created these big open spaces for their design office to exist. One of the criticisms of this McLaren place is a beautiful building with this beautiful long kind of boulevard, they call it, where they keep all the old cars. But to actually work in there and to go to another department, sometimes you have to walk 10 minutes to get an answer to something, which,
Interesting.
or you have to send an email rather than go face to face. So as impressive as it is, there's always been a question of how much it was a vanity project with Ron Dennis in charge at the time, and how much it was actually a fully functioning F1 factory. Because actually, if you go to some of the best, or the teams that make the best cars, Red Bull, Mercedes, so on, the factories are actually fairly bland. They're just operational places where things get done, not places where you film Star Wars or the Avengers or whatever else. But anyway, but back to Nate's point, I mean, they do have a great facility. They do have, this presentation of this team, which is really very special, but they're not delivering. And actually, to go back to the overreaction question, we'll be lucky to finish in top 6. I think they will be, because they're going to have to beat, you've got the obvious ones, the obvious 4 now, which is Red Bull, Ferrari, Mercedes, Aston Martin, and then you got Alpine there as well, and then Alfa Romeo, getting in amongst it. Aston Martin last year didn't finish in the top 6, so I think they're really going to have to turn it around to be able to do it.
So I don't know if Dave, our producer, has been looking at this in the background. I think I've got this wrong about the Avengers. I'm pretty sure they filmed something there, because there's.
I believed you. That made sense to me.
Yeah,
so...
I think what I've done is I've seen an Andor post. I think maybe it sounds like we're just massively plugging Disney Disney things at this point, doesn't it? But I think but either way, Laurence made the great point. It's so futuristic. It could be used in Andor. So I hope people aren't flocking to watch their Avengers to try and spot the empty.
Confirming it was used in Andor.
There you go.
Not Marvel.
I cannot find anything that says it was used in Marvel.
Okay. Fair enough.
Well, there you go. So so again, this shows you, Lawrence's predictions might not have been perfect at the start of the season, but his memory about which buildings were used for Star Wars products are.
I'll take that. That's all I can get right now.
But just quickly to go back to the point about the McLaren headquarters, the one that was used for Andor and not for Avengers. It's kind of an odd building when you think about McLaren's recent history, because in the boulevard, as they call it, there's all these, they have basically the entire history of the McLaren team out there. And I don't think that you could go to Red Bull or Mercedes, who have been dominating for the past, 10, 12 years, whatever it is. You wouldn't find the same kind of tribute to themselves there. Red Bull have this huge trophy cabinet when they go in. They do have their cars out there, but it does not equate to what McLaren has done on track, both in terms of what they've delivered, but also it's kind of this great celebration of the McLaren team. And you just think you can't have this factory sat here when you guys are struggling so much in Formula One. So yeah, I've always the more I've gone there for season launches, you look at it and you're like, this place is, it just does not fit at all with the team that we're reporting about all the time.
Interesting. All right, well, let's give out the best of the rest awards for this week. One driver who might not have obviously been a talking point on our show, but somebody who really impressed you with the drive.
I'm going to say Logan Sargent for me. Super impressed with Logan. I spoke to him during testing, had a one-on-one with him, and he seemed really, really chilled, really calm, and was really solid all weekend. But especially that first lap, it's going around on Twitter. See if you can find it if you're listening. Fantastic first lap. For the first lap in an F1 car at a race start, you would have been forgiven for being super timid and thinking, just want to get through it. But none of that. He's got some balls, as somebody at Williams said to me at the airport. Well, I was on the same flight back with Williams, and I said, we're chatting, and they're like Logan, man, on the race, we weren't, not that they don't rate him, but they were like, we weren't expecting that. We did not know, we didn't know exactly what we had. So when your own team is surprised at just how well you've done, I think that says a lot. So great start. And, an American back in Formula One, it can't be a bad thing.
That's a great shout, Logan Sargent. But I'm going to go with Alex Albon's teammate was mightily impressive as well. And Valtteri Bottas is another driver who I think kind of went a little bit under the radar, but put in a very solid performance. Alfa Romeo as a whole, I think, have actually delivered a pretty decent car this year that maybe hasn't got the recognition it needs. And as that team morphs into Audi over the next 3 years or so, I think we're actually going to see them become stronger and stronger, which is why a team like McLaren needs to kind of watch out and sort it out as well.
How are you guys?
What about my
How are you
guy,
guys?
Pierre?
That's what I was going to say. How are we not mentioning Pierre Gasly in this from 20 to 9?
Abysmal
Sure.
quali, and then great
I think
results.
both of us.
Lawrence isn't sold. Lawrence is not sold.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, the qualifying was bad because he was 16th fastest even before he had his lap deleted, and he was 16th fastest by exceeding track limits. So he started 20th, and then I mean, it was certainly a very good race. But I think that car is actually pretty good. And look at what happened to his teammate Esteban Ocon. Everything went wrong that could go wrong. It was penalty after penalty after penalty. So I didn't think we saw the true performance of that car in the race from Ocon's side. So look, Gasly did a great job. Don't get me wrong. I'm not taking away from him, but it was the qualifying performance which got quickly off.
All right, I've already chewed like a choo-choo train, so I'm not going to bark on this show. It's time for the Doghouse.
I'm going to go with a technical director and Mike Elliott, who is basically the man overseeing the car that Mercedes put on the track at the start of this year. And given the resources they have, given the struggles they had last year as well, he's a lovely guy, but I feel like he's got to take some of the flack for the performance of the car, because it wasn't the drivers, it wasn't really the strategy, it was the performance of the car that was so far off.
Fair.
So that there were two technical directors we were talking about, Laurence and I, all weekend. The other one is at the other team we've been talking about and saying they need to do better, which is McLaren, James Key. I'm not sure how much it's all down to him, but I actually saw him during the week, and I'm pretty sure Laurence saw him at the airport, and he looked like he wanted to be anywhere else. But McLaren, I'll put McLaren as a whole in, because I think to fall that far down the order for your first race, when you see Aston Martin doing what they did, is pretty bad. But I think if you're looking, it's a weird kind of prediction to make, but if you were to ask somebody who are the first high profile departures in Formula One this year going to be, it would be James Key, who I've put in the Doghouse, or it would be Mike Elliott. You would imagine at Mercedes, just given the fact that both of those guys have looked after teams that are kind of so far behind in where they want to be. So yeah, it's a very Mercedes based Doghouse, because obviously McLaren have Mercedes engines. So bad start.
I think one other candidate, if we're going to talk about the drivers, is Esteban Ocon going too far in his grid slot, which resulted in the first penalty. Okay, the second penalty wasn't his fault. The team worked on his car before then, but I think it was because he had damage to his front wing, so they kind of were trying to change that too early during the 5-second penalty, and then he sped in the pit lane as well. So that was another penalty on top. And given, as we just mentioned, what Pierre Gasly was able to achieve in that same car, that's some missed points definitely for Esteban. So I think he, of the drivers, and I think he knows it himself, he's very self-critical. I think he'll look to basically turn that all around next time around. But yeah, one driver in the Doghouse as well.
Is it fair?
Have you got a candidate?
Well, is it fair to put, and as much as this pains me, to put Haas as a team in the Doghouse a little bit? I mean, based on Nico Hülkenberg, by the way, I mean, there was a lot of hype there based on his qualification. And then obviously what happened the next day, I think was probably a hard result to stomach for Haas and Gunther Steiner.
Yeah, I think so.
Oh, there you go. We've
You
jinxed
both agree with me.
Yeah. I think as well with MoneyGram coming in, Haas came into the season with really big expectations. So bit deflating for them. And I think, I'm pretty sure Gunther Steiner said they had the most perfect test they've ever had. So they really did come into the week, really feeling confident, and I think that was a bit of a kick in the gut.
Yeah, it was. Well, we'll see how all of these teams respond. They've got a weekend off. That means you two have a weekend off. I hope that you enjoy. And then obviously we will be back next week to preview the Saudi Arabian Grand Prix. As always, thank you for tuning in to Unlapped. Thank you both for your analysis from the ground. I appreciate you both. Remember, subscribe to ESPN F1 for more F1 content. Like this video, leave us comments, and then hit us with a 5-star review wherever you get your podcast. Cheers.